I think I'm just in the room next door to belief, and I can hear the sounds and smell the incense and hear the rustling of fabric as people stand or kneel and hum along with the hymns and feel great comfort. I don't disdain or judge people who are in there, but for me, the distance, the negation, the absence of that for me has been a fruitful one.
Welcome to Point of Relation with Thomas Hübl, a podcast that illuminates the path to collective healing at the intersection of science and mysticism. This is the Point of Relation.
Pádraig Ó Tuama is a distinguished Irish poet, theologian, and mediator with interests in conflict, language, and religion. He presents Poetry Unbound from On Being Studios. Poetry Unbound is a partner in the 2025 Collective Trauma Summit, a free online event in October where you'll have access to Pádraig's interviews of renowned poets, Raymond Antrobus, Haile Lysa-Ghaffori, and Richard Scott. We hope you enjoy this episode of Pádraig and Thomas in Conversation.
I have the honor and the pleasure to be sitting again with Pádraig. Pádraig, very warm welcome.
Thanks, Thomas. Nice to be with you.
So my first question is, when you hear trauma and spirituality, what's the first thing that comes up for you?
I always think, whenever I hear spirituality, I think of the etymology of the word spirit, spirare from Latin, meaning breath. And so if I think of spiritual trauma, one of the things I think about it as an interruption of the capacity to breathe, suffocation, ultimately. And yeah, that's the first thing that comes to my mind.
That's beautiful.
Many others too. But.
So, no, that's really beautiful. It's lovely, because the breath is so central in our spiritual practice.
Yeah.
And maybe let's go to the next footnotes, the footnotes of breathing.
Well, I'm just thinking about what you just said there, Thomas, that the breath is so central to our spiritual practice. Like, another way of saying that same sentence is the breath is so central to our breathing practice, and the spirit is so central to our breathing practice. All of these things mean the same thing because they're all the same word. We've associated with certain manifestations of the word, one about a practice, one about just staying alive. But in all of them, we're saying the same thing, which is partly the fundamental nature of the body and also the fundamental nature of the body in connection with something else, often other people. And also perhaps a grander story that we wish to be part of in some way or another. A grander story of a spiritual community or of a nation or any kind of group of belonging. And I think the more the group promises, the deeper the potential for harm is.
Say a little bit more about the last part you said.
Well, I've met so many people who would go along to a church, say, and would give evening times and weekend times and money and heart and professional service and volunteerism because they really hope for something back. And that something back is both realistic and unrealistic. It's realistic in the sense that they hope, that people won't be dicks. That's not a bad hope. Like I hope that regularly. But on the other hand, people are people and terrible things happen. And I'm not talking about criminal abuses in this context. I'm talking about the everyday ways within which, when the heart is invested, profound sadnesses and disappointments can happen. That can be very difficult to know how to cope with. A friend of mine was a Lutheran pastor of a church for a long time, and when they'd have a kind of a Sunday when there was lots of people who would be coming for intake, she'd say, you've come here because you've heard this is a place that's inclusive of LGBT people, that is serious about trying to say stuff about justice and racial justice and indigenous justice and environmental justice. And she said, we try, and we will never give ourselves excuses for failures there. And even if we get all those things kind of okay, you'll still be disappointed at some point by me. She was speaking as the leader, by whoever's next to you, and to say that this is therefore a community that has to find a way to know what practices we have to hold that together. And that, quite apart from whether this is a church or not, I thought that wasn't a bad opening statement for a heart-involved group of belonging. And a heart-involved group of belonging can be a yoga studio, or a church, or a startup, or a constitutional group, anything you place your hope in for it to help you be part of something better. That always comes both with promise and with risk.
That's a beautiful way of saying it. Like I just want to repeat the heart-involved belonging and investment into a group that you hope will do better in the world, and you are part of it, and that's always comes with the potential heartbreak or with the potential pain, suffering. And so that's a beautiful way to open our conversation. And let's maybe stay a little bit with the church or the spiritual environment that you grew up in. I mean, you're from Ireland, and so how did you, growing up in Ireland, how did the ecosystem and the spirituality of the ecosystem that you grew up in, how do you feel that affected you? What are the traces that are alive in you somewhere from that ecosystemic imprint?
I only have 300 things to say in response to that, Thomas, each of which will take approximately 1 hour. So I'm trying to think about how to be wise. What to say. So the first thing to say is that in the Ireland I grew up in, and the environment I grew up in, and the language I grew up in with English and Irish, that Irish identity was primarily much more important to me than Catholic identity. But Catholic identity and Irish identity were tied together in a powerful way because of the long legacy of British presence in Ireland, coming with the English language and coming with the Protestant religion. None of that had anything to do with spirituality or who gets into heaven. It had everything to do with, mechanisms of power. So that's the first thing to say, is that for me, the relationship with religion has always been one of, where the overlap of where that experience was one where theology, politics, the past, history, colonization, and indigenous language, as well as a new language, all met together. So that's the first thing that comes to my mind. That's the first of the 300. Maybe what's the second?
But it was very fast. So if you,
I know. I want some credit for that. Thank you, Thomas, for acknowledging that. Let me see what the second is that comes to my mind. It gave an extraordinary sense of, well, this is the way the world is. I think I was shocked the first time I heard about somebody who didn't go to mass. You're like, what do you mean you don't go to mass? Are you allowed as a human being to not go to mass? Friends of mine were trying to help their daughter years ago come to terms with the fact that the world can be complicated. And they said, not everybody lives the way that's important to you. And she said, you mean that some people don't recycle their cardboard? And they were like, yeah, some people don't recycle their cardboard. And it broke their hearts to think, my God, look at what you're going to have to learn about the world and about yourself. The idea that she's going to be the great virtuous innocent throughout that's incorrect. So I suppose linking with that is to be part of a system of belonging that you think works for you. Gives you a sense of the world. And then suddenly when you realize that there's other places, one of the things that can do is to go, well, then there's us and there's them. And religion is not the only thing that does that. I kind of think everything does that. Another friend of mine was out once waiting for a bus, and my friend's son heard somebody speaking Polish and said, what's that they're saying? And the mother said, that's Polish. It's a different language. And the kid said, well, I speak normal. And it's funny, it's cute, and presumably very quickly the child realized, oh, there's different languages and they're all normal. But you just look at what is it that imagination about somebody who is not you, what is it that does to the system of belonging? And so those are not unique to religion. They're kind of, you find them, and they're not necessarily violent either. The question is how do you live with them, and how do you put yourself into the situation of thinking, oh, just different. I'm the different one, I'm the foreigner, and so I don't think these need to be educated against. The question is how is it that, given the likelihood that they'll crop up, we pay attention to that. So within all of that, I suppose I see that the world of belonging given to me by Irish Catholicism. Everybody goes to mass. The priest is involved at school. Very scientific friendly. Absolutely to evolution and all that. It wasn't a biblical fundamentalist tradition. It was a tradition absolutely open to science, and that wasn't exceptional. I mean, Catholicism has fundamentalisms about authority, but not about evolution or the world, the universe, or those kinds of things. It isn't a literalist tradition when it comes to biblical poetry. So on the one hand, it opened me to the world, but that openness came with certain kinds of conditions that I've had to spend a long time examining. And let me see, I'll give you a third. So I'll give you 1% of my 300. I think the third is very practical. It was music. There was music everywhere growing up. I played the guitar, so music, playing that in church groups, singing in school. I had this great teacher when I was maybe 9 and 10. Miss Sheehan was her name, and she taught us songs from all over the world, songs in all kinds of different languages. And they were all songs that were kind of associated with liturgy, but they used all kinds of different names for God. "O Great Spirit, whose voice is heard in the wind" was one of them. It was an Indigenous American prayer. And in that way, it was opening us up to the non-universality of the universality of desire. The fact that these yearnings crop up in different ways, in different places, with different names, and with different objects for association. And that was a tremendous education. And the songs that she had were in the religion book at school. She wasn't the exceptional one who brought them in out of her own volition. They were just there. So I suppose that's the third thing to say, one of great gratitude to her, as well as whoever put that textbook together.
Oh, that's beautiful. It's beautiful. The first one that you started with, and then I come back to the second one, but the first one, like colonialization. So how do you feel like the British colonialization of Ireland lives in you? How did that condition you, imprint you? How does that live in you? So when you say even some of the spiritual kind of community aspect is connected to or are connected to politics, how did the colonizing part, so Irish language, English language, and especially for you, because you're such an amazing poet with your words, there's such a flow. So how does that live in you? How does this also affect your poetry? And this split, so maybe you can speak a bit about your experience there.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that, like, the Irish experience of colonization was severe, and one of the things I hold myself to is that when Irish people travelled out of Ireland, often fleeing, looking for safety, looking for some kind of income, Irish people discovered, we're white, and became secondary participants in the very project that had been a decimating project in Ireland. So I don't in any way wish to claim that because we went through this, that therefore we are indemnified from accountability for the legacy of the last 200 years of Irish diaspora. So, and I'm part of that. I live half the time outside of Ireland. So I hold myself to an accountability with that. So that's important to say. I think there was just a way within which we were told, and I think incorrectly at times, that Irish Catholicism was a particular demonstration of Irishness, and so therefore the cultural overlap was so strong. In the same way with lots of religions, Jewish friends of mine talk about kind of being Jewish and atheist, and the question about belief or shared dogma, you're like, no, you're absolutely culturally part of this tight rites of passage based community. That the question as to what you actually believe or how you'd articulate about what you think the question of God is, that's up for debate. But what's not up for debate is, go to this service every year or whatever it is, whatever the bare minimum conditions are. So I felt brought up in those kinds of conditions, and there's a lot of benefit to that. It gives a powerful communal sense of the village. The question is for whom does it not work? In terms of colonialization, I mean, Cologne, in colonialization, coming from the French word for field, there's a way within which, from my earliest days, as a 5-year-old, apparently I said to my parents, why don't we speak Irish all the time? Like, why are we speaking this other language? I don't think they were that bothered. They were like, oh, there's this place called England, and they like to go places. And that was it. That was my introduction. But it made me think, well, who goes places and why? And so language, as part of the desire for communicating and understanding, it became clear to me that history, well, what is history for some actually is present for others. And that the past, for what somebody might say, oh, look, for God's sake, that was the 1600s that Britain did that, is the very language that I'm speaking to you in now. So the past is not the past for everybody. And the question as to whose experience of the past is the one that's measured is a powerful one. And the accountabilities I place on myself with that, in as much as I'm a critic of empire, I also don't think that this has much whatsoever to do with English or Scottish or Welsh people today. I don't hold them individually accountable for doing something that they can't undo. No, that doesn't interest me. There isn't a family in Ireland, I'd say, who doesn't have a sense of gratitude for how it is that during times of difficulty in Ireland, England was a place where people went to work and send money back from. Even if some of the financial circumstances of Ireland were due to the economic policies of Britain, still, on an individual familial level, so many people went back and forth. It's a beautiful place. I love British humor, and I don't want the recognition of the past of that to be something that inhibits my spiritual, and I mean this very practically, my spiritual vista about the dignity and the honor of Britain. There's plenty to be proud of in Britain. What began as the health service, it's under strain now, but it was extraordinary. British socialism, it's fascinating. Humor, art, language, poetry, literature, so much to be proud of. And I honor that. And that for me is part of a spiritual thing too, for me as an Irishman to recognize that it is worthwhile the dignity of recognizing dignity from elsewhere, to recognize that colonialism is a story of horror, and one that if I scapegoat individuals today for that I am not allowing my imagination to flourish, and also that if I use the story of that to indemnify myself from the possibility that I can do the very same thing individually as well as part of a diaspora, or a part of community at home regarding racism in Ireland, that I'm also gifting myself the ignorance that is going to burden others and be painful and wrong upon others. So all of those things are part of the same thing for me. I often feel like my mind is a patchwork, and I don't say that helpfully, because I kind of feel like I always want to put 12 or 13 things together, and I can't look at just one thing because I think that they're all linked. And I think that sometimes it means that I'm more of a generalist who skates over things rather than somebody who goes into particulars. So Other people could correct factual inaccuracies that I have, or that. But I hope trying to hold the tension between these things is in some way beneficial.
One thing about that, when you feel like, when you say your mind is a patchwork, when you feel like the music of English and Irish language, since you're so refined in playing the music of poetry, what's the different experience? Is there a difference in the experience? Is it the same? How does this the language resonance body live in you?
Yeah.
And does it make any difference for your poetry?
Yeah, that's a nice question. Yeah, I mean, there's something about hearing a language that isn't spoken in the majority of the country on an everyday level. There's something about hearing that you feel a sense of connection with the bones of the earth upon which I was born. I find that very moving. I have a friend who cries often when he hears Irish. He didn't grow up in a community where it was offered as a subject in school. So for him, hearing it is a reminder of what he doesn't know, of the presence of an absence. And I think that too is a relationship with your own language. It's a relationship with what Claire Mitchell, a great, brilliant Belfast writer, calls the ghost limb of the Irish language, the presence of the absence of it, where you can feel the itch, even though it's gone.
That's beautiful. The presence of the absence. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so that's the music part of it. Like, I will say as well, like, I'm gay, and I growing up, and this is not unique to religion. It's too easy to scapegoat religion for it. You find it in sports groups, in lots of groups of men, whatever that the arrangement of that group is. The idea that if you were gay, you were a failure of the masculine, and the misogyny that's behind that, and the resulting violence towards women of all sexualities and genders. That was eventually became a lesson in wisdom in my 30s. But it took until then before I was able to, I think, act a little bit wisely. Up until then, I was desperate to belong.
And how did that express itself?
Well, I went along to places where I didn't really know there was alternatives, but I was involved in religious groupings that believed that if you were gay, you were possessed by a demon, or that somehow you were psychologically deficient, and that either exorcisms or some inadequate and pretend form of so-called therapy was an appropriate response. And while I didn't know that there were other places, it didn't seem available to me to leave those religious groupings behind in all religion. I have such respect for people who I know, same age as me and older, given the same circumstances, like, nah, screw it, I'm out of here. And I have such respect for the fortitude and the clarity of insight and analysis that they had. Somehow I didn't have that in me. And somebody said, oh, you really had something to give. And I think that's a very generous reading of it. I think I was very frightened. It took a long time for me wrestling through it, thinking through it, before I was able to exhibit the kind of fortitude in people who I see who demonstrated the clarity of their insight and analysis much, much earlier on.
And how do you feel this affected, like, because the faith community is a resonance body for like a deep spiritual immersion, potentially. I mean, it's not always happening like that, but I think its original purpose. Yeah. So, like, I'm curious how it affected you on the one hand, like that the community thinks there's something wrong that needs to be corrected through whatever methodology, or like how did this affect your belief in God, your groundedness in spirit, your like the essence of the religion? Did this affect in any way your connection to that inner essence? Did it not affect that? Did it kind of stay on the outskirts of your being and psychology? How did you feel that?
when you say the inner essence, are you speaking about the kernel of something that you would say is fundamentally good in terms of that relationship with spirit and spiritual practice?
I mean, that's already something you said right now, right? So that maybe that's part of it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder. I can't conjugate a sentence in Hebrew, but I know a few hundred theological terms from biblical Hebrew, so utterly ineffectual if I'm wandering around Tel Aviv. I can't ask for a cup of coffee, but I can talk. I can talk about covenant. I love the Hebrew word lev for heart, and that the heart, as it's spoken of, is not. Often these days people say, oh, the space between the head and the heart, as if somehow those things aren't part of the body. It seems from reading the heart in the Jewish tradition and in Hebrew biblical literature is this place of encounter. Perhaps something like what we'd call the psyche now, both in Greek mythology as well as in, the psyche isn't just your cognitive functionality. It's also all of these extraordinary dynamics, that the heart is that place. The heart is the place of prayer. The heart is the place that can be deceived and hurt. The heart is the place of thinking. And there is something so fundamental about one's sexuality, because it's even different from the crudity of the erotic activity. No, that's not crudity. Different from the specifics of erotic activity. Sexuality goes to the core of what it means to be human, because this is how the human species, how any species continues to exist. It's the very biological mechanism by which the population perpetuates itself. And so to receive a message in culture and gender and religion that core part of you is deficient or demonically possessed or psychologically unfit at its most fundamental intrinsic level, by basis of being, LGBT, you begin to perceive the damage of that message way before you have words for sexuality or identity or gender expression, but you absorb that message very early. And so it's very difficult. Like some people would say, oh, it's just another sin, like robbing, don't rob, don't be gay. You're like, well, that's an inadequate categorization of two things together. It's easy to not rob, perhaps. Not that people haven't robbing. We're talking about colonization, but I think that for any message like this that goes to the primary identification with your experience of being human, a message that says that there's deficiency or justified prejudice or justifiable hatred or etc., levied against indigenous people, levied against enslaved people of different races, genders, so in so many ways, I suppose I'm very cautious. I can speak about how difficult these experiences were for me, but I'm also very aware I'm a man. I've grown up in Western Europe. We didn't have much money, but we had an education system that has benefited me hugely. I'm able-bodied. I'm privileged, and I don't mean that in any way to demean the fact that I lived through trauma. Of course I did. And at the same time, I hold that trauma alongside with the accountability of going, okay, well, and that for me is a spiritual practice too, is to recognize the trauma and to have it in its place in as much as I'm able.
Right, and to put it in a context, right? But that's already like a mature function, to be able to put our trauma into a context and not go into either or, but to go into and as I hear you speak about it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Collective trauma has universal principles or roots, because trauma is painful all over the world. It doesn't matter which cultural field we are coming from. So we want to be mindful of the specificity of trauma, and we want to be educated and connected to the universality of trauma. And that's why we develop a global community because the intelligence also around the world, with the different wisdom technologies, with the different scientific breakthroughs and the global collaboration, can create a new perspective onto collective trauma that we don't have yet. So it's not that collective trauma is out there. We are all aspects of collective trauma. We all carry some of it in ourselves. And that's why the more we can create a global community, the more we can begin to see and become aware of the massive impacts of collective trauma and begin to heal and build a new world together.
Visit collectivetraumasummit.com or click on the link in this episode's show notes to join the 7th Annual Collective Trauma Summit, a 7-day global gathering guided by over 40 expert leaders in trauma healing, embodiment, somatics, and social change. This year, we've partnered with mission-driven organizations, including the Internal Family Systems Institute, the Embodiment Institute, Poetry Unbound, and more, to help you deepen your understanding of trauma and see how healing can become a force for transformation in your life, your community, and the world. We hope you'll join us.
I have some, let me see, I'll turn around and grab it. I was put through 3 exorcisms for being gay, which were kind of humiliating. I wrote some sonnets. Can I read one?
Yeah, please. Mm-hmm.
I wrote 7 sonnets. There's this idea that you find in, I think it's in medieval Christian religion, of the 7 deadly sins. Mm-hmm. So I wrote 7 deadly sonnets. I'll just read one of them. This one is called The Exorcism, and the first exorcist was a public exorcism, was a woman from California, and this happened in Dublin when I was 18. The week after my 18th birthday, actually, to the day. 18 and a week. The Exorcism. I wished you weren't American. I wished you didn't see intrinsic evil in me. I wished you hadn't dragged my secret from me. Now I know you knew already. Someone squealed. I wished you didn't put your hands on me while you were screaming at the devils in me, all my homosexualities. I wished you'd never gathered people round, instructing them to pray in tongues or read from Revelations or chant, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. I wished you'd shut up. I repeated, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. I wished he'd answered. I wished you dead. And I was frightened at the violence in me and the nest of demons in me. I wondered where they lived. In my semen? In the dreams I had of being kissed? Why did they breed in me? My God, my exorcist.
Wow. This is very powerful. Like I can feel the transmission of when you read it. Wow, it's touching me. Wow, it has a strong power, like of what your experience that you went through.
Yeah, I heard. Being told you have a devil in you puts a devil in you. Like that's a very straightforward equation psychologically, or it even puts the resistance to that. So. I heard once, because I did some studies on demonology and just the mythology about demons around the world. I heard once that some cultures believe that if you act like that, a demon comes upon you. Now, I'm not sure that I have this right. What I read said that this is in some Chinese theater communities. The idea is that when you act, that somehow you become possessed by something, and that when people clap at the end, that they are helping you take that off. That it's, and that the demon isn't this idea of this macabre thing, that this is part of the whole thing. Aren't we always having something coming upon us? And when I read that poem, I'm always really glad to put that demon of rage on me, because it isn't me anymore. And I can look at it, and I've exhibited it through some of the strength of language. I wished you dead, and I was frightened at the violence in me, and where do they live? In my semen, to make reference to body functionality like that is itself its exorcism, and I find such joy in the artistry of this, to use the same word 6 times in 2 lines. Jesus, 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 Jesus. Like that for me is part of the playfulness of going, look at what language can do. Language was used to oppress, and this is using artistic language to lift the lid, to let all those devils fly. And to say, I only have 1 demon. My God, I've got 100. Listen.
Well, I'm still touched by the intensity of the transmission that you give when you read that, and also I'm feeling into listening to you. I'm feeling into how, like, what's the impact of that which is the most sacred, our, like the church in this case, or any kind of spiritual community, demonizing a certain part of us. Like, what's the impact of that? On the one hand, the most pure or the most ethically aligned, on the other hand, coming as in a form of pain or judgment or distortion. So, like, how they're connected, like the effect that has on you in that case, or on others, experiencing that, because it's a very intimate, because you said it yourself, Jesus, 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 like the very resource in the essence of our being connected also to the demonizing of a part of us or a certain aspect of us, and how that is similar or different from the sports club.
Yes. It's surprising, to see how similar and different it is. The question for me is, what is the belonging that the group offers? And I like the word belonging, but I recognize it's become an economy. A silly story. I bought a watch a few years ago, a Swatch watch. I'll give the Swiss some advertising. And the guy in the shop said, do you want to come to a Swatch watch party on Thursday night? I was like, what? And he went, there's a Swatch watch party on Thursday night. And I was like, immediately going, well, I'm definitely not going, but what happens at a Swatch watch party? And he said, well, everybody there is wearing a Swatch watch. I'm like, is that all they're wearing? Because then it would be a very different kind of party. And then he said, and we just sit around and talk about our Swatch experience and what it's like to belong to the Swatch community. I was just like, oh my God. Presumably he was saying this because he'd been told to say it, and told you have to do this X amount of times during the day. So he was just doing his job. I wouldn't hold that against him. But part of me was like, who came up with this idea? And it's the idea that I see somebody else with another Swatch and go, I should have 2 swatches, And so belonging is an economy, and belonging is a form of deception as well as a form of promise. So I'm careful about belonging. I don't take it automatically as a word of either malevolence or benevolence. The question for me is, how do we use it? And so religion might make promises of, well, you'll be pure, you'll have access to some form of human redemption and change. So many people want to be better, you'll have access to heaven, There's a story for understanding what happens in the thing that we cannot explain, death, and it gives you a framework for looking at the world. And sports, for I'll speak from my context, for sports for an Irish boy, a cisgendered Irish boy, was kind of saying, well, you'll be part of the lads, one of the boys. And you will be looked at differently by every other boy in your class if you happen to be good at this thing. And no high score in mathematics or any examination will get you the look of, we want him with us on our team, that than certain select sports will get you. So while each of these things are under different responsibilities, you see abuses of power in enormously in sports communities, enormously in educational facilities, enormously in banking facilities, anything to do with power. I suppose I read some Jacques Lacan for my many sins, and I'm interested in how it is that he takes, penis envy and the imagination of phallic power and castration and the recognition that everybody will have to recognize what he calls castration. Maybe Freud does too, but that's ultimately that the power that you think you've had will change and fade, even if you ever did have it. And often it may be that you never even did have it in the first place. And other people will come and take the trophy that you either had or wanted to have, and you'll recognize your time has passed for one reason or another. And that this form of disappointment is itself a profound lesson in your own personal anthropology and how it is that you're going to live. So I do place the church under huge responsibility, alongside many other forms of group belonging.
Yeah, this is very deep. I'm very, like, it touches me to just be a witness to your life's process, or to your, like, the few things that we are out of 303. 1% of your life has a lot of depth and also complexity, obviously. But I think also here for us in this course, it teaches us a lot about, the power of like spiritual communities and the belonging, as you said, but also the shadow aspects, like how it can hurt or inflict pain. And I'm wondering, like, circling back to number 2, as I said before, I'm still with you discover that if somebody doesn't go to mass, is tell me the footnotes of that sentence. Like, how did that shatter your innocence, and what was the impact, and how did it evolve throughout your life from that moment of sobering? Or
I'll use some broad brushstrokes. When I was 11, I started to go along to these kind of holiday camps that were I suppose they were called Bible camps. It was youth work, religious youth work, really, and there were some lovely people involved, including one Belfast man called Aldo Magliocco, Italian mother. His father had died when he was very young, maybe 3, and his mother decided in 1967, I think it was, when Belfast was exploding, his mother decided, I'm going to move with no English from Milano to Belfast. I always said to him, why? Like, did she know anybody? No. Did she speak English? No. She opened up a fish and chip shop in West Belfast. Anyway, he was a youth worker, a man of great spirit, a man of great love, a great ecumenical imagination, and ecumenical coming from the Greek meaning the whole wide inhabited world. I owe so much to that absolutely lovely man. He died a few years ago, very young, 54, of cancer, and I live my life in moments of gratitude to that lovely man. So he was Catholic, but most of the other people involved in these holiday, Christmas or Easter or summer camps weren't, and I didn't know this until my mother said to me. And there was a very nice woman who was a nurse from Cork, where I grew up, Bernie, and my mother said, she's Protestant. And she whispered it to me almost like it was a secret. And I was like, what? And partly in the naivety and sectarianism of my imagination and my civic experience was that, like, if there was one thing worse than not going to mass, it was being a Protestant, And so, and my mother said, they're wrong. And, like, clearly I already knew this because I was so shocked. And I was so sad for poor Bernie that she was going to hell. I was terribly sad for her because she was so nice. She came along to my parents' prayer group once and was singing along with all the songs. They were kind of lively 1970s upbeat. biblical texts put to this kind of new choruses. And I watched her and just remember thinking how sad I was for her. So fast forward maybe a year or two, and I no longer thought that Protestants were wrong. I wanted to become one because I thought they were right. And so the introduction of the right way and then all the other ways quickly became, is my way right? And I began to go, well, actually, I prefer theirs. They've got, more women leading, and they've got more livelier songs, and they talk a language that isn't so liturgically obtuse as I found that then as a teenager, And so it very quickly became, that crisis was good, the stepping to think, okay, my belonging is terrible. There's a better kind of belonging. The zeal of the convert can be a complicated thing for the people who are left behind, which isn't to say people shouldn't convert. They should do what they wish. But there's a mechanism of trying to seek the purest form of belonging that can, all of these, it isn't just about what works for me. It can sometimes be about saying what's wrong in the one you've left behind. Often there are things wrong in what you've left behind, but sometimes there mightn't be. So it's all of these complicated human dynamics come into play. And so I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful to have, in many ways, had to start that so young. But I started it from deep in the womb of strange belonging. And up until that point, at the age of 11, my experience hadn't prepared me for anything different. And so, I'm not trying to be too hard on myself, but I do sometimes think, oh God, that would have been pretty. That boy was in need of some education. So.
Oh. And how is it today?
About whether I want to be a Protestant or not?
No, how did it? No, most probably not. But how is it
Probably
today?
not.
What did it evolve into for you today? Like when you look at your perspective today, so you started off at the time, you converted, and then
I didn't. No, I just wanted to. I wasn't allowed to convert. How did it evolve today? When it comes to religion, speaking specifically about that, I suppose I feel like I'm in the room next door to belief. The idea, like it's a question of theoretical physics. What is the first movement of the universe? What is the thing that caused the bang, that caused the thing? We don't know. And theoretical physics has some beautiful language about that. I love thinking about nothing, capital N, nothing. Paul Valery said, Dieu a fait tout de rien, mais le rien perce. God made everything from nothing, but the nothing penetrates. What a beautiful formulation to recognize that. Emily Dickinson says, nothing is the force that renovates the world. And so I suppose it's that kind of negation of language, the apophatic tradition, that I find very moving and very powerful. And I find within all of the world's great traditions, there's been people writing extraordinary things like this for millennia. So I don't put upon myself the burden of belief that somehow I have to have an opinion about the prime mover of the universe. Belief is the wrong verb there. I think I'm just in the room next door to belief, and I can hear the sounds and smell the incense and hear the rustling of fabric as people stand or kneel and hum along with the hymns and feel great comfort. I don't disdain or judge people who are in there, but for me, the distance, the negation, the absence of that for me has been a fruitful one.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And maybe before we slowly come to a closure of the conversation, it's amazing. It's almost an hour past and we'd covered just 1% of your story. But the living in Ireland and like the fragmentation or also the conflict in Ireland, how do you see the cultural aspect of the impact of the collective trauma, or maybe even the intergenerational trauma, how would you read the cultural fabric?
There are many lenses about this, and I think there are other people far more who have access to far more data upon which they can base actual analysis. I have feelings about stuff, but they would fade away very quickly in the presence of somebody going, well, here's the latest statistics. So first of all, I want to say that. I mean, for me, in 1845, there was this thing that's ostensibly called a famine. We don't call it a famine. We call it the Great Starvation on Gort the Moor, because the deaths were preventable. Well, of course they were. I think it's hard to look at the Irish contemporary economic landscape without paying attention to what it was like when conservative estimates are that 1 million died and 1 million left. That's on the basis of not having had overly accurate census data. So I would think a lot more. That changed the landscape of language, changed the landscape of city. Ireland had a very, very high rural population previous to that. And suddenly after that, rural people flocked to cities. And Belfast, for instance, I think went from something like 60,000 to 600,000 over the space of 10 years. Extraordinary as industry came. The poor people with different backgrounds coming, and you had this kind of patchwork and hodgepodge there. Questions about, because evictions were used as a tool of community control. If a family were evicted and their neighbor said, come in with us, that neighboring family were evicted. It became a crime to show hospitality, which is a deep code in many, many cultures. It became a crime to show that if you were a peasant farmer working for mostly an absentee British landlord. So questions about home ownership in Ireland are very, very high in a very particular way. I think, I don't have the data, but I've heard some people say that. I'd be happily proved wrong. At the start of Brexit, when Britain was, the question was, is some of these trucks that come from the Netherlands, say, and go across Britain and come to Ireland with food, that's called the land bridge, just in terms of common day parlance, to talk about what's happening, that it's faster and cheaper rather than to get a ferry from Rotterdam to Cork or Dublin, to go quick across the channel, across Britain into England, into Wales, and then across. That was faster and cheaper. And as the then British Home Secretary Priti Patel was speaking about it, she said, people were saying, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? And she said, well, if we have to starve Ireland, okay. And like the outrage was not, of course, that wasn't going to happen. But for somebody to say that, and then especially people were like, she's of Indian origin, where there also had been a so-called famine. Like, how can you say that? And so I think these things are very high in the psyche, and they crop up in things like that. Now, of course, I'm no fan of the Tory party. I also know that she was under an agenda and was saying something that for her was just throwaway, So while I'd like her to have demonstrated more responsibility and more historical accountability for, working for the British government, being British, working for the British government, I wouldn't want to levy any kind of crimes against humanity against her. That's wrong. It was clumsy, but it tapped into something in Ireland that was, the level of shock was palpable just a couple of years ago. So I think those things are present. And at the same time, there's great cultural heritages. I mean, this is coming up to number 3 about music. I think culture is a powerful thing for shaping a sense of fluid belonging, to play, to listen with music, with poetry, with the artistic tradition. Every culture around the world has these things. And while they can become competitive, yes, they are also a language. And it's deeper than just who's got to number 1 or who's won the local competition regarding music or dance or recitation of poetry. Knowing them in itself is its own pleasure. Whether you write them or know them or recognize them or sing along or lead them or just enjoy turning it on, hearing it in the background. All of those things can be a great thing. And so that for me, alongside the history, is also a legacy of something very generative and powerful, which is to say, listen to these beautiful songs. Yeah.
It's lovely how it fills your heart, like how it fills your being when you speak about it. You transmit that sweetness of the music. It's lovely. So seeing the time, Pádraig, first of all, it's again super enjoyable for me to speak to you. I think I could go on for hours, and
It's always nice to talk with you, Thomas. Yeah.
It's like you're such a fountain, and it's you speak so authentically, and you really speak from the depth of who you are here, and it's a very personal questions also. If you were to leave us, everybody who's listening to us, with either something that we didn't speak about or any kind of question that is connected to spirit, trauma, healing, anything that you think is important, I don't know, to contemplate, to walk with, inquire.
Yeah. Well, it's something that I try, which is the recognition of the profound regenerative power of creativity. And I don't just mean by that by a piece of painting, any form of creativity, cooking, making a nice invitation to a friend to come around, something that's making something that wasn't there before, making something happen out of seemingly nothing. That corresponds, I think, with the mystery about who the hell are we and where the hell are we? Somehow we still can make something happen, A few years ago, I got an email out of nowhere from someone that said, "You don't know me, but you know my wife. And she died last week." This is a young man. She was young too. And he said, "I wanted to tell you," and he wanted to ask if he could use a poem of mine, as if I denied permission, as if he needed permission for use a poem in the funeral. But he just told me a bit about himself. I now see him every week. He's become a great friend. And he made something happen out of nothing. That's an act of creativity. And there's risk in that and vulnerability. And that, I think, is one of the crises of conflict, is the presence of despair, and the sense that there's nothing to be created, and all that there will be is destruction, destruction, destruction. And on people in situations of leadership as well as individuals, I would hope that what we could do is ensure and legislate for and make decisions based on a society where not only I can imagine myself creating and being safe enough and loving enough to have a situation to create a friendship like that, but that others could too. And so for me, creativity, while being a beautiful word, is also a political word.
Very much so. That's so lovely. Thank you so much for your presence, your spirit, your vulnerability, your honesty, your authenticity. And it's always lovely, and I don't know, it reaches me in my heart when we speak. And I'm sure many others can take it
very kind
out of this. And looking forward to our next meeting.
Yeah, me too, Thomas. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Point of Relation with Thomas Hübl. Stay connected and get updates about new episodes by visiting our website, pointofrelationpodcast.com, and by subscribing to the Thomas Hübl YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share about us with your community on social media. Thank you. We appreciate your support.